just begin by introducing yourself and telling us a little bit about the work you do.
My name is Lynn Mактаггарт. I am the author of a number of international best-selling books, The Field, The Intention Experiment, my latest book, The Power of Eight. And my work is really about the new science and trying to understand the science of spirituality, where the two meet, but also the power of our thoughts and the fact that thoughts are an actual something with the capacity to change physical matter. And the fact also that that amplifies in a group. So I've been testing that. I'm the architect of a thing called the Intention Experiment, which every so often runs scientific studies using my readers and scientists around the globe to test how far we can take that with the power of our thoughts.
Amazing. So your first book was The Field, right? And it was kind of the beginning of your discovery of how we're all connected and how thoughts actually become things or can affect matter. So can you talk to us a little bit about what The Field is and maybe touch on some of the global intention experiments that you did?
I was fascinated by the idea that there are many studies showing that spiritual healing works. So I figured if you could take a thought and send it to someone else and make them better, that in itself undermines everything we think about how the universe works. So in the late 90s, I started interviewing and speaking to many cutting-edge scientists, physicists, biologists, and I discovered that they were on the verge of what is a new science, a completely new view of the world. The underpinning of all of that was the discovery that we are all part of a giant energy field, a quantum energy field. And that has a lot of implications. First of all, we're not solid and stable things. We're also not collections of chemicals and electrical signaling. We're a lot more subtle than that. We are a collection of vibrating energy at the subatomic level. Our subatomic particles are trading energy back and forth with each other, but also with all the things in all the universe. So this little game of tennis is going on between all the things in all the world. And it has a couple of amazing implications. Subatomic particles are also waves, and they have an infinite capacity to store information. So when two waves bump into each other, they take on the other information. So essentially, this field is like a mothership of all of the universe's information for all time. Also, waves go on to infinity. So essentially, if we're part of this giant energy field, we have the capacity to access information anywhere in the universe. So I understood that this really changes the idea of healing. Because if we're not separate things in a separate universe, in a separate planet, then we have influence on each other. And certainly the evidence I saw was one of the things that is a big influencer is thought. Thought's actually a trespasser that can go into other people and things and change them.
So that's awesome because information is always constantly being exchanged through this field, right? We're all connected. It's showing how kind of science and spirituality are overlapping, explains why prayer might work or intention might work or good vibes, bad vibes. So talk to me about how this is demonstrated through these global intention experiments that you're doing, and then also now in the smaller groups for healing.
After I researched what became my book, The Field, I had a little bit of unfinished business, which was a lot of evidence that was coming through experiments by these scientists that thoughts are an actual something with the capacity to change physical matter. So I have a background as an investigative reporter. And so the journalist in me was basically saying, well, how far can we take this? Are we talking about very subtle effects like shifting a quantum particle? Or are we talking about curing cancer with our thoughts? So I decided to put this to the ultimate test. By then I knew a lot of scientists working in consciousness research. And I also had a lot of readers around the globe because the field was in 30 languages. So I thought, well, if I just put these two things together, I'll have the biggest global laboratory in the world. So that's what I did. Every so often, I would ask a scientist at the University of Arizona or Penn State University, University of California, to set up a very well-controlled study. And then I would invite my readers or an actual audience, if I were speaking somewhere, to send the same intention to affect that target. And we started out small, doing things like trying to make seeds grow faster and trying to purify water. And we moved on to trying to lower violence in war-torn areas and highly violent areas in America and elsewhere, and even healing someone of post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, we've run 33 experiments to date. I wasn't at all sure it was going to work, but it worked. It really worked. I mean, of those 33 experiments, 29 have shown measurable, positive, mostly significant effects. Just to put that in context, there's no drug out there that has that kind of consistent track record.
So how long are these people, are they sending intention for 10 minutes or an hour? What does it look like?
The most amazing thing about the intention experiments and also my Power of 8 groups is it doesn't take years of disciplined practice or hours of priming to do this kind of work. Every single intention experiment, every single Power of 8 group only sends intention for 10 minutes. And yet, we're having this extraordinary effect. With the peace intention experiments, where we've tried to lower violence in a number of war-torn areas, and we've succeeded in all 7 of the ones we've run, by the way, we've run it over multiple days. So we've had 10-minute sessions over 7 or 8 days. And we've seen extraordinary effects. But that's the real power of group intention. You don't need to be a Sufi master or a Buddhist monk in order to have an effect. You have this healing capacity inside of you, and everyone does.
Okay, I just want to try and wrap my head around this whole global intention thing. Let's take the experiment about the war-torn areas and how does it work if all these people are sending intention to the field? Like, I can wrap my head around it in a small group for healing, but I don't know. Tell me more about this global intention.
I've concluded that there is such a thing as a psychic internet. And just to give you an example of that, one of the studies we ran was trying to make seeds grow faster. We worked with the University of Arizona. They prepared 4 sets of 30 seeds, took photos of them, sent them to us, and they were labeled A, B, C, and D. And I had an audience with the first time we ran this experiment in Sydney, Australia. So I asked my audience of 700 to choose one of the sets of seeds. They chose, let's say, D, seeds D. We didn't tell the scientists which ones we were choosing. We sent intention to those seeds, then told the scientists to plant them. They planted all 4 sets of seeds, still not knowing which ones we sent intention to, and then measured them 5 days later. Only then did we unblind the study and tell them which ones we sent intention to. And what they discovered was the seeds that were sent intention grew significantly higher than controls. Now, we ran that study 5 more times. Every single time we sent intention, and that was from Rhinebeck, New York, and South Carolina, and Dallas, Texas, Los Angeles, and over the internet with my international audience. Every single time, the seed sent intention grew significantly higher than controls. So let's just think about that first experiment. I'm there in Sydney, Australia. The seeds there, and we're sending intention there, and the seeds are in Tucson, Arizona, 8,000 miles away. And we're not sending intention to the thing, we're sending intention to a photograph of the thing. Nevertheless, we are having an effect. So that demonstrates how we can zone in on things via the field and have that effect. And what I've noticed even in my small groups is that you don't have to be in the same room together. They work just as well when we do them over Skype or Zoom. You can create that Power of 8 circle virtually. You can create a psychic internet wherever you are with a common thought.
That's remarkable. So is there a significance to the number 8? or like it's the infinity sign and there's all these spiritual connotations to it, but how did you come up with 8?
The power of 8 came about by total accident. I decided in 2008, after we'd run a couple of these intention experiments, that it was time to try to scale this down to a workshop. But I wasn't really sure how to do this. So I'm sitting there with my husband one day, and I said, I don't know what I'm going to do. I guess I'll put them in groups of 8 or so and have them send healing intention to a member of the group with some sort of health challenge. So my husband, who's a great headline writer, also a journalist, said, yeah, I love it, the power of 8. So that's exactly how it started. We had our first workshop in Chicago. We put people in groups of 8. We had them send healing intention to a member of the group with a health challenge. And I figured it was going to be a feel-good exercise, like getting a facial, nothing more. Next day, we have people come back, and we ask them to report on what had happened, the recipients, and this is what they told us. Things like, I was scheduled for a knee replacement. I can hardly walk, and I'm walking normally today. I have terrible depression, and it's been lifted. I have terrible IBS, and my gut feels normal today. I have cataracts, and I'm 80% better. And on and on and on it went like that. So I was dumbfounded. I figured this must be a placebo effect. But in every workshop I ran, no matter where I was in the world, and that includes all over the world, from the Middle East to South America, I put people in groups, and not only the receivers, but the senders also were getting healing. So I had no idea what was working here. Certainly, it didn't have to be just 8. 5 works as well, 12 works as well. It just needs to be a small group. I think if it's more than 12, it gets a little unwieldy, and if it's less than about 4 or 5, it's not really a group. 8's kind of a sweet spot. It's like a Goldilocks figure, not too big, not too little. But there's no other significance other than a group and a group effect and an amazing, amazing instant healing effect. But that's the thing that's most extraordinary to me, is I run these over and over again, even in a conference setting where people aren't really even working with me, and we have instant healings. 10 minutes, that's all it is. For instance, we had a woman, another person with terrible arthritis whose knees were so wobbly she could hardly stand, and at the end of the 10 minutes she did a deep squat, and she was able to cancel her surgery. We had another woman who had a stroke and couldn't focus her eyes, and after her healing intention, she could focus normally. We've had people with stage 4 cancer reverse their cancer. We had a woman who had scoliosis. Her back straightened so much afterward that she had to change the rear view mirror of her car. And on and on and on it's been, thousands of times. And not just health issues. People have used these Power of 8 groups to heal other parts of their lives, their financial situation, their careers that have got stuck, their relationships that are estranged, even their life's purpose. Everything with regular meeting in Power of 8 groups seems to improve.
That's awesome. So you mentioned the placebo effect. If someone's belief is really strong, is this like a one and done thing? Like do the Power of 8 healing and then boom, you don't have to deal with arthritis again? Or like for people with cancer, you have to do a full radical lifestyle change, right? You got to change your diet, you've got to heal emotionally. And for the more skeptical people, do you have to do these group healings like more than one time to make it really sink in? Or can you just do it for 10 minutes, receive the healing, and then not change anything else in your life?
I think it's always wise to follow good diet, exercise. There's a number of pillars of healing that are really important. But one of the real key pieces of any health regime is community. And that's something that's really overlooked. But if you look at the evidence, community is central to people's health. The reason most people commit suicide is because of what psychologists call excessive individuation. They feel left out. Belonging is so important to us that if you have a group of friends, a strong community, it protects you against heart disease, stroke, even the common cold. But these Power of Eight groups are doing something far more than a placebo effect. Of course, there's an element of belief there, but we've had healings with people who are non-believers, very skeptical. We helped to heal a young boy who tried to kill himself by throwing himself off a 40-foot structure onto hard ground. And he got out of the hospital. He wasn't even expected to live. Our groups started sending him healing intention over 3 weeks as his stepfather kept a running commentary of what was going on with him. And he got out of the hospital in record time. Now, I know it wasn't a placebo effect because, like most 15-year-olds, he believed that his parents' ideas about the power of intention were pretty stupid. So it wasn't placebo. Here's what's going on. First of all, there is the power of intention. And I've investigated this from every angle in my book, The Power of Eight, and elsewhere. There's also a group effect. There is what scientists like to call collective effervescence. Something magical happens with a group. But the key piece here, the real key piece, is altruism. What I've found is the group effect is a giving and receiving. And a lot of people actually have better effects. Their own lives begin to heal when they get off of themselves and start intending for someone else. I discovered this when I wanted to really study these groups for an entire year. This was the first time I ran what has become my Intention Masterclass, which I run in the beginning of every year, and it lasts for an entire year, where I teach people, but then I put them into groups for an entire year. And they're meeting virtually, because these are people from all over the globe. What I discovered in the first one was that initially, people had some amazing healings. You know, we had somebody with lifelong suicidal depression ask his group to intend for him to find the cause. And this was a guy who was a clinical psychologist and an integrative specialist, so he'd tried everything in the book. So his group started intending for him to find the cause of his illness, and it suddenly popped into his head to see a Chinese herbalist. And that guy determined that one of his liver filtration systems wasn't working. And with that, Mitchell had that sorted, and he overcame his lifelong depression. We had plenty of cases like that, people getting financial windfalls, getting new dream jobs when their careers had been stuck, but a few people weren't getting anywhere. One of those was a woman called Andy. Andy was going through a divorce. She had 2 small kids, and she needed to get a new job. Very talented in marketing, very talented coach, and she couldn't get a job, no matter what she tried. So we were going through a lot of things with her, me and her group, and finally I was exasperated, and I just said to her, Andy, just get off of yourself. Just start intending for someone else with, who's in a worse situation than you. So she did. She started intending for this young boy who would try to commit suicide, Luke. And what she discovered was even more amazing than what had happened to Luke. Within a few days after getting off of herself, she gets a call out of nowhere offering her her dream job. Now that happened more and more and more, so that I started investigating the science of altruism. And it's amazing. Altruism is like a bulletproof vest. People who do things for other people, the science shows, live longer, happier, healthier lives. Anything done for someone else helps you. People who are ill, who help other people with the same illness, get over their own illness faster. It's really extraordinary. But the thing that really, really clinched it for me was a study looking at 2 groups of people. One group lived what we'd all consider the good life. They had loads of money, they were going on lots of vacations, they were just living, they were pleasure seekers, they were living the dream. When scientists look at their immune system markers, they found that they were terrible. These people were going to drop like flies. They were going to be dying soon of any one of a number of degenerative diseases, heart disease, diabetes, Alzheimer's. Then they looked at another group that weren't as affluent, but were living a life of service. These people were going to live forever. Their immune systems were so robust. They were going to live long and healthy lives. And that, to me, really spoke loudly about the power of getting off of yourself. The power of avoiding what we all think about with personal development now, which is the self-help movement. Just think of those words for a while, self-help. It's so focused on the self, and I think can be something really toxic about that. What we really need to do is start working on other help if we really want to improve our own health.
So it sounds like your research is really demonstrating what these spiritual principles that have been around forever have been saying, like where two or more are gathered, or it is in giving that we receive. So is the power of intention, is it the same as meditation or prayer? Is it like we're praying for someone? Like how best can we do this?
There was something really interesting that I discovered when I was trying to find some antecedents for this. Because, after I discovered the power of 8, I kept thinking to myself, well, somebody else has thought of this before me. So I consulted a bunch of experts in indigenous practices and esoteric religions. And of course, there have been many groups. Most major religions put people into groups, prayer groups. The Protestant and Catholic religions have prayer groups. Jewish religion has minions. They need 10 people when they're trying to heal someone. And the Islamic religion puts people in groups, in circles around the Kaaba. But no one, as far as all of these experts could tell me, knew of any practices where there was this extraordinary rebound effect that I was seeing, where the senders were actually getting healed as well as the receivers. And also in my intention experiments, I was amazed to see that there was some sort of mirror effect. The people who were sending out intentions for peace, I surveyed them afterward, all of our participants, and we had, tens of thousands running these experiments. And back came thousands of surveys saying, I felt like I was part of a higher network. I was crying uncontrollably. And also, more significantly, I made up with my estranged wife or husband. I connected with my son, and I haven't spoken to him for years. I have got along better with the people I work with. My family and I are getting along better. But this was the amazing thing. About half of the people said, I am in love with everybody I come in contact with. People were hugging strangers. So I started to realize there's something in this whole group intention experience that creates a sort of mirror effect too. If you intend for peace, your life becomes more peaceful. Just as when we were doing healing intentions for a guy with post-traumatic stress disorder, thousands of people wrote back to say they'd had personal healings. So I couldn't find this in any, practices, any esoteric practices, until I found a little-known sermon written by a Baptist minister who was arguing that the Bible had some mistranslation. And he was talking about the Acts, the part where the apostles are setting up the new church, and they're trying to follow Jesus's instructions, and it's been after the crucifixion, etc. And it talked about how he had instructed them to pray. And the King James Version says they were told to pray with one accord. Now, that's a very anemic way of saying what was really in the Bible, which was the word in the Hellenic Greek, the original, was homothumadon, which is an adverb that means passionately and with one voice. And it's also a musical term. Think of a Beethoven symphony where all these instruments come together for this collective sound. So that's what Jesus was telling them. Pray passionately and with one voice. And he also said, you will heal and you will be healed. So I started thinking about, wow, all of this, and thinking maybe there was something in the power of 12. Maybe that's why it was so important to have the 12 apostles. And their first act in setting up their church was to gather about 120 people, and they all prayed passionately and with one voice. So I thought, wow, this has been around a long time. This is Jesus' power of 12. But it's very different from prayer and meditation, what we're doing. It has certain links with prayer, but in intention, I always tell people, be highly specific. When you're doing prayer, oftentimes you leave it to the universe to decide. You say, or a higher source, thy will be done. But this is a specific request to the universe. It's also very different from meditation. And I know this because the skeptic in me needed to do studies on the brain waves of the participants. I needed to find out what was going on. Luckily, Life University, one of the largest chiropractic universities in the world, were fascinated by this too, and they put their neuroscience department at my disposal. And so we ran a series of experiments with student volunteers, put them in Power of 8 groups, and put an EEG cap on one member of the group who was doing the sending. And we found very quickly that that person would undergo major brainwave changes. There would be a dialing down of the parts of the brain that are involved in making us feel separate. Particularly the parietal lobes, which sit right here toward the back of the head. And they tell us what's us and what's not us. They help us navigate through space. Well, they were turned way down. So were parts of the right frontal lobes that are involved with worry, doubt, negativity. They were also turned way down. And other portions too that make us feel separate. These were brainwave signatures of people in a state of ecstatic oneness. And they differed markedly from the brainwave signatures that people have recorded with people doing meditation. What they were closer to were the brainwave signatures that have been recorded by Dr. Andrew Newberg with the University of Pennsylvania of Sufi masters in the midst of chanting and Buddhist monks in the midst of ecstatic prayer. These were people undergoing essentially a mystical experience, a state of ecstatic oneness. But here was the amazing thing of it. They didn't require, years of practice as you need to become a Sufi master. They didn't need, hours of preparing themselves and getting in the right state, as you do if you're, a Buddhist monk in ecstatic prayer. These were student volunteers who had never meditated before, much less put a Power of 8 group together, and all they had was a 12-minute video from me telling them the rudimentaries of what to do. Nevertheless, they were transported into this incredible mystical state. So there was only one conclusion I could draw from this. You don't need sweat lodges, and you don't need to crawl for hours on your knees or go into, an altered state for hours at a time. All you need is a group, and you have a fast track to the miraculous.
It's incredible. So for someone like the woman Annie, I think that was her name, who you said, get off yourself. So the person sending intention, for them to feel like the brainwave changes, the healing effects, the ecstatic oneness, is this something they can do themselves? Like, just as a practice to get attention off themselves. So often we're looking in the mirror and we're beating ourselves up and we've got this critic in our mind saying we're not good enough, we're not rich enough, we're not thin enough, whatever it is. As a way to implement a practice, can we just spend 10 minutes a day and send healing intention to someone else as a way to kind of release healing chemistry in our bodies, or do you need a group? Like, is there a hack?
You don't need a group physically present. You can create a virtual group. I have hundreds and hundreds on my website where people have come into my forum and either joined an existing group or set up one. I have master classes that I run over an entire year where people are meeting virtually. They may be in the same time zone, but they're hundreds of miles away. And they will meet for years and never have actually physically met. Nevertheless, this is their intention family. These people are closer to them than their own relatives. So you don't have to have a group present to take advantage of this intention receiving and sending. But I think you do need a group. What people do also in my community is every week we send intention of the week. We have 3 people who are selected with serious illnesses, and the whole community sends intention to them at a particular time. So this is sent separately through your computer screen. Nevertheless, it has an effect. We've had some amazing healings with the receivers, but we've also had amazing healings with the senders. I had one woman who had terrible, crippling arthritis. She was a painter who could no longer paint, and she would get in there and do intentions every week for our intention of the week nominees, and suddenly her arthritis disappeared. So I think there is that power of just getting off of yourself. I think it's more important, though, to say, oh, what am I going to get out of this? You have to do it with an honest heart and just say, yes, I am sending to them. But just know that, as you send, you receive anyway. It is, it's just part of a kind of universal law. But also, there is just the feel-good atmosphere and the feel-good thing inside you of, number 1, being part of something larger, and number 2, of getting off of yourself and truly offering this with a giving heart.
Yeah, and that, it seems like ultimately, we come into this world, we're born into this world, and there's this separation illusion, right? And that's kind of how our medical system operates. There's separate organ systems, and we're looking for something outside of ourselves to heal ourselves, like a drug or a doctor. So it seems like ultimately the healing elixir lies in love and connection. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I wrote an entire book called The Bond, which was all about refuting Darwin's idea of survival of the fittest. There is so much evidence to show that we were never meant to be alone. We were always supposed to be part of a larger whole. And aside from belonging, which is so essential to us, we also need to give. There is a real need in us to give. There's a real need in us to be fair. There's a real need in us to agree and to be part of something larger. And when we're not, we experience disconnection, illness, and all of those things, which is why connection is so powerful in preventing illness. There was a really interesting study of the Japanese. Epidemiologists can't figure out why the Japanese, who smoke like chimneys, don't get cancer. But they do, and heart disease. But they find that their heart disease actually starts mimicking the typical rate of most Americans when they come to the U.S. But some Japanese transplants don't have an increased risk of heart disease. So when the epidemiologists looked closer, they found something really amazing. They found that diet had nothing to do with it as to whether or not these transplanted Japanese would get heart disease or not. What mattered, the only thing that mattered, is whether or not they could recreate the close community ties that they have in the old country. And that is what became protective for them and what is protective for the Japanese in Japan. When they went to Japan to look at this magical X factor, the Japanese turned to them and they said, well, this is so obvious. You Americans, you're so lonely. You even walk down the street alone. Anybody could see this. So to them, the idea of that kind of separation, of our kind of aloneness, is really anathema. They don't experience that. And you see that with many other studies too of, depressed people, people with certain genetic propensity to depression. Scientists looked at two groups. One were a group in the Far East, and the other group were a group of Americans. And they found the group in the Far East had a higher percentage of the gene that should have made them depressed than the Americans. Nevertheless, this Far Eastern group had a much lower incidence of depression, and that was because they have closer community ties than we do. And so this is really all about the power of groups. Harvard researchers said, if you join one group next year, just one, a reading group, a bowling group, whatever, you literally have your chances of dying.
Okay, so there's the whole question about ethics in energy healing or remote healing. Like, you have to get the person's permission before you work on them. What if you have a loved one that's just not open to this at all? They're full conventional, and you have a group of loved ones that want to get together and send healing intention to them or do this work on them. Will they receive the healing if they're not on board with it?
A person who doesn't believe in it can receive the healing, and it can work. I mean, I've seen it work many, many, many times on babies, on fetuses, on people in comas, on non-believers. But I have a rule of thumb, which is, I think if somebody is conscious, they should have a choice as to what they have as a healing mechanism. Now, if they get a Power of Eight group, essentially, intention prayer for them, that may be disturbing if they're an atheist. What's really important in healing is what you believe is going to work. I used to say, when people asked me, because I run a magazine called What Doctors Don't Tell You, and people used to ask for many years, well, what's the best cancer treatment? Because chemotherapy doesn't work very well in most cases. And now I say to them, what do you believe is going to work? Because that's possibly the most important element of your healing regime, your own belief that it's going to work. Because what we're really talking about is the power of the mind to heal you. And so when it comes to a Power of Eight group, it's really important that that person at least give his permission, even if he doesn't believe in it.
Got it. Okay, so what does an intention sound like? Say we're going to put someone in the group and send an intention to them for 10 minutes. Give us an example of an intention.
Well, the way these Power of Eight groups run is usually I put people in an unbroken circle, as opposed to somebody in the center of it. If somebody is in the center, I usually ask a couple of the people to put a hand on him or her so that it remains an unbroken circle. And they feel the energy going between them. And the energy is very, very strong. An intention needs to be really positive and specific. So let's say Jane Doe has a pain in the big toe of her right foot. So it would be our intention, and we always do our intention as a group. Our intention is that Jane Doe be free of all pain in the big toe of her right foot and be healthy and well in every way. So I throw in the healthy and well in every way, but really the real important focus is to really focus on the area that is painful, that is hurt, that is ill, and it's okay to do that. There's a lot of healing modalities that say, oh, don't mention the pain or you're going to get more pain. That's rubbish. You need to tell the universe what you want. And it's okay if there's a negative. As long as you're saying be free of, overcome, be healed of, tell the universe what you want.
Beautiful. So let's go back to your skepticism. You know, you started as an investigative journalist, an investigative reporter, and you talked about how kind of you weren't really on board with the whole law of attraction thing at first. So how has your skepticism evolved over time?
I started out not really believing in the power of intention, I'm sad to say, now that I'm considered a kind of expert on intention. But I do have a background in heavy-duty investigative reporting. I mean, I was busting baby selling rings when I first started out work, and with hidden microphones and tape recorders. So the idea that we can have a thought and send it to someone else and make that person better was really alien to me. And I also thought that a lot of the popular ideas about intention, you know, manifestation, law of attraction, and the like, were very facile, that there had to be something more. I certainly saw a lot of evidence with some of the scientists that I wrote about in the field that thoughts are an actual thing that affect other things. But I really wasn't sure how far you could take this. So I was really skeptical about it. And when I started seeing in front of my eyes these instant healings, and not just one or two of them, but thousands of them, I was just shocked by it, really shocked by it. And so shocked that I really needed an explanation. I kept saying to myself, I need more proof. I need more antecedents. I need something more, which is why, even though I first discovered the power of 8 and the intention experiments were first carried out in 2007 and 2008, it took me a good 10 years to get up the courage to write a book about it in my book, The Power of 8. I mean, for many years, I asked things like, when I was looking at these peace experiments, where we consistently seem to lower violence in war-torn areas and very violent areas like St. Louis, Missouri. We sent intention to the most violent place in America, which is a portion of St. Louis, Missouri. And we demonstrated a lowering of violence by 43% there, and consistent lowering of violence in Sri Lanka during the Civil War there, Afghanistan, the two most violent areas, and even Washington, D.C., and Jerusalem, most recently in Yemen. We saw a consistent lowering of violence. But I used to say, well, did we do this? Well, who knows? There are a lot of variables going on there. And now I've got to the point, after seeing thousands of people being healed, after seeing consistent results in these intention experiments, I've really become a believer. I mean, part of me says, did we do that? Well, who cares now? You know, people are getting healed in the thousands. And what's more important, maybe I understand some of those mechanisms. You know, it's probably a group effect, it's partly intention, it's partly altruism, but there's also an X factor that I'll never completely understand. And I've had to give up that sense of skepticism and understand something really important, which is when we come together as a group, miracles just happen.
Amazing.
One of the things I noticed when we did an intention experiment for the 10th anniversary of 9/11 was I had participants both from the Arab countries and from America. And I found on my Facebook page that after we sent intention to these two areas of Afghanistan, the two sides were coming together more. They were forgiving each other for 9/11. So I started just thinking about that and thinking about the power of intention experiments and group intention to heal polarized societies. So I had an opportunity to work with some specialized equipment. In November 2017, I was doing a summit for the Middle East in a studio that could beam me out to different locations, wherever there was a camera. And we had a camera in 8 different Arab cities. And the 9th camera I had worked with an Israeli documentary maker, and she put a ninth camera in an audience filled with Israeli Jews. So we had Arabs and Jews on this experiment, and my audience around the world who were getting it live on YouTube. So we decided to focus on Jerusalem, an area of high violence, which was of interest to, Arabs, Christians, Jews, etc. And with this technology, I could talk to them, but they could also talk to me. So we ran this experiment, and afterward, the most amazing thing happened. The Arabs started sending love to the Jews. The Jews started crying and saying, "Your God is my God." They started forgiving each other and coming together. It was so amazing. It felt historic. And it went very viral over social media and the actual media in Israel and the Middle East, where they said, well, maybe little initiatives like this are more powerful than all the diplomatic talk and political talks that go on in healing old wounds. So I started thinking about this, and I'm planning a big experiment that will unite another batch of polarized people, which is the Republicans and the Democrats in America, who really need some healing. And we want to put them into some of the same auditoriums together and watch what happens after they do this kind of intention. And I also was really curious, how could just one 10-minute intention, soften people's hearts? And I found some really interesting science from the University of California at Berkeley. They found that they focused on a thing called the vagus nerve, which is the longest nerve in the body. It starts at the neck and it winds its way through all of the major organs. And something really amazing happens when we do something compassionate, like even looking at photos of starving children, but particularly involving ourselves in a peace intention experiment. It activates the vagus nerve, and when that happens, we feel much more connection to the other, people not like us. And so, of course, that's probably what happened. Just engaging in this big peace intention experiment enabled the heart to leap across the fence. So we need to try this with Americans. We definitely are going ahead with a big peace intention experiment this year and next to unite this hugely polarized society.
It's great. So I think what's coming up for me now is forgiveness, and how, everyone I've interviewed says that forgiveness plays a key role in healing. And so when you have separation, or when there's ego between you and the other, or you are only seeing differences or judgments, that creates separation. And then when you forgive and then go beyond forgiveness and actually send blessings to the other, there's a reconnection, right? There's a reconnection, and that's healing. That's remarkable.
I think what really works well in forgiveness is strong truth-telling. One of the things I teach is, I've seen it in a lot of reconciliation type of dialogues, is, when there is some transgression done against someone else, there's an imbalance going on. And even if there's, a court and justice or whatever, it doesn't restore that balance. But what does oftentimes is deep truth-telling, and telling what happened and taking responsibility for it. And there's a guy called Orland Bishop in California who is doing what is considered the impossible. He's getting rival gang members to connect with each other. And this is remarkable because, this is one of the most violent places in America, in Watts, California. But he's succeeding because he's having these young men tell their story, the deep story of why they believe what they believe. And that becomes a real connector and a mechanism for forgiveness. But it also holds somebody up to account. And one of the most beautiful examples of that was a peace dialogue run by a friend of mine, James O'D, who put together polarized groups and warring groups. For instance, at one of these dialogues, he had a former member of a Nazi youth movement, and the daughter of Holocaust survivors in the same group. So they were allowed to talk to each other very frankly. And so she said to him, "So what did you do during the Holocaust?" And he said, "Well, I beat up a few Jews, I broke a few windows, but, I was only 16. And she said, "Okay, if you were 10 years older, would you have sent my parents to the gas chamber?" And I mean, this was a whole other level of truth-telling. And he suddenly got very quiet and really upset because he realized in his heart, yeah, maybe I could have been a mass murderer. And so he was so upset. He started talking about this and saying, I was so young, I followed what I was supposed to do, but I was a Nazi, my children are Nazis, my grandchildren are Nazis, I will never escape this. At which point, Mary began to feel great sympathy for this guy, and she reached out her hand and said, essentially, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." And so her heart at that point leaped across the fence. So that kind of deep truth-telling, I think, is really essential to forgiveness. But what I also find is coming together in these intention groups almost transcends all of that, because we suddenly have this visceral experience of oneness, and it removes that sense of separation immediately.
Awesome. So one more technical question. When we are doing the group healing and we're setting intention, are we each saying it quietly to ourselves over and over again for 10 minutes, or are we speaking it verbally out loud?
In our groups, we have people design an intention together. So they decide our intention is, and they make it very specific. And when they do the 10 minutes, they start out just getting into sync with some breathing, holding hands, but then just holding on to the intention themselves silently, while imagining that person achieving that intention or that situation coming to pass. And there are lots of other techniques involved, which I go into in my book, The Intention Experiment and the Power of 8, but that's essentially it. And as I say, I've just found that 10 minutes works fine. You don't have to do this for hours.
Have you done any research or seen any results with something like ALS, which to me is like one of the most daunting diagnoses you can get, or things like terminal cancer, things that society thinks are incurable? Have you seen any results with those types of things? Do you need to do repeated group intention healing the more serious it is? What have you seen there?
Well, we've reversed stage 4 cancer in Power of 8 groups. We have people with diabetes who are suddenly off their medication. We have people in all kinds of so-called no-hoper diseases, multiple sclerosis, who reverse it. So there's no disease that the power of the mind can't heal. Just talking about ALS in another sense, and coming from my perspective as editor of What Doctors Don't Tell You, we found that one of the big reasons that people get things like ALS and multiple sclerosis is heavy metal toxicity, particularly mercury toxicity from silver fillings. So one of the things that somebody should do if they do get ALS is look inside their mouths and get that mercury safely removed if they have it. And there's other things like very low vitamin B12 levels, which can contribute to those kinds of illnesses. Bottom line is, there isn't such a thing as an incurable illness. There is only a patient who hasn't found the right modality to treat themselves.
Yeah, and like your psychiatrist friend that was depressed, you could also use the group intention to find out or discover what the right route is or what the solution might be. So that's great.
Absolutely. Over and over again, I've found that the group can be something that helps somebody find the path to healing. One of the members of our master class was a woman with 15 years worth of chronic fatigue. I mean, she could barely take her dog for a walk for 5 or 10 minutes without having to lie down all afternoon. So she used her group as the beacon for helping her find the solution to this. And she had tried every kind of alternative treatment, and it just hadn't worked. So with their help, she discovered that the real problem was mold in her dressing room, black mold. And as soon as that was cleared out, and cleared out of her, she's now lifting weights, she's going on hikes, she's cured.
That's amazing.
One of the things that's really important about Power of 8 groups and their success is meeting regularly. I mean, most of the groups I see where people are getting healed and their lives are getting healed are meeting every week religiously, as much as they can. And certainly I notice it in my year-long master classes. Those people who meet together, I noticed this in the very first one where I studied everybody. Of the 250 people on the course, 150 met regularly in this very first group. Of those 150 people, pretty much 100% of them had major life transformations. They had financial windfalls when they needed it. They changed careers and had amazing new careers. They overcame all kinds of incredible and difficult health challenges. And they had a new intention family. They'd made up with estranged relatives. It was extraordinary what happened to them in their lives. And they said, many of them said, you know, the group was like a soup that changed my brain, as one person said. And another person said, you know, this is very different from individual intention. I know, I've tried it.
Yeah, that's great. It's almost like another spiritual practice or tool. You know, if you practice these things regularly, they can change your life. Like meditation for stress relief or reconnection to the divine, or, you know, this group healing. You're making a conscious intention or decision to connect with community, and that is healing. So it's a great practical tool you can leave with people. With that said, what is your one takeaway message on healing?
I was really fascinated by the song One by U2. And I used to think that the line, we get to carry each other, was about obligation, you know, burden. And now I realize it's much more about privilege. You know, that carrying each other is the route to our salvation. So essentially, don't play small when it comes to your health or healing. Always seek power in numbers.